Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next speaker, Krasimir Kotsev, presenting the topic, The Art of Vulnerability Management, Practical Application of Cyber Triage.
I've been doing cybersecurity for 15 years and they said, that's impossible, you're so young. I started when I was 14 as a grey hat hacker, let's say, because when you're 14, you're hacking things here and there without actually knowing what you're doing. And with the time, actually my passion evolved into something more professional. So as of today, I'm the founder of Kikimora.io and SoCyber. So these are two companies. The first one is a vulnerability management and orchestration platform, which allows you to keep away the hackers from your infrastructure. And the second one is a company specialized in, guess what, pen testing, offensive security, and vulnerability assessments. Today we're going to be talking about vulnerability management in 2024, and actually I'm calling it vulnerability intelligence because it's not management anymore. It used to be management 20 years ago when we didn't have huge organizations with huge amount of IT interconnected systems, right? When we had about 2,000-3,000 vulnerabilities, and you can manage this one. You can remediate, you can patch, that's okay. Patch Tuesday works for everyone. Nowadays, that's simply impossible. So it's an art, actually, to cope with all the vulnerabilities out there. You need some specific methodology or approach for this one. So imagine that today is your first day as a security manager in a big corporation, maybe a nuclear power plant or an energy company, and you've been tasked to find out the vulnerabilities of the company. What's the first step? You start by actually identifying the IT connected systems in the company, right? So you start by discovering the infrastructure, the network, IP connected systems, and day number 2, you found out that the company has, actually the team is telling you we have an approximate of 3,000 devices, which is, it doesn't make sense to you because it doesn't mean anything. So you run your vulnerability discovery, you check your attack surface modules and your threat intelligence feeds, and you find out that actually the total number of systems is 3,170. The activity actually took about 2 weeks to complete with all the vulnerability scans, the agent data which was gathered. Can you guess how many vulnerabilities you have approximately? That's a real-time data, an obfuscated one from all of our customers. Just try to guess blindly what's the total number of vulnerabilities and weaknesses detected for the 3,000 systems. 25,000, there was a good one. Say again? 100K? Okay, you're close, 62,000K. That's for 3,000 vulnerabilities. Now, a lot of you will say, okay, but this data is meaningless. I mean, how can you actually have 62,000 vulnerabilities? Well, the answer is you don't. Actually, out of these 62,000 to be more precise, you need to find out what's the most critical to your specific organization. Not all of these are actually affecting your infrastructure. Not all of these are exploitable. Not all of these are affecting external assets of yours or critical assets of the company. So we need to find out what are the most critical 5% which are endangering our organization, right? Out of the 62,000, about 5% are actually critical to your company. And they need immediate approach. So they cannot wait for the next patching lifecycle or for the next penetration test. They need to be remediated immediately. How do we find out what's the most critical 5%? We start by actually gathering the information with some vulnerability scans, with some IT security audits, and guess what? We end up with a huge vulnerability database because we have scanning in place, but we also need penetration testing, right? Because we have some critical web applications or mobile applications. On top of this one, we are ISO 27000 certified, so we have some compliance scans. We are also auditing the cloud infrastructure. Not only this one, but we also need to mark pass and fail for the compliance officers when they need this information. There is a bunch of vulnerability discovery methods out there, usually more than 10 in a company, in the average company. After actually spending several weeks of sorting the data, we end up with an Excel sheet covering all the vulnerabilities out there with system identifier, domain name, IP address, system owner, remediation owner, and so on. So it's great. We have an Excel sheet. And in this big organization, you can expect these 3,000 devices to be managed by a team of 10 or 15 people maybe. So what are you doing? You're sending the Excel sheet to all the responsible parties are there. Out of this one, they create Jira tasks in 2 hours, right? 62,000 records, it's quite easy. You just create the Jira tickets or you assign it to the office desk personnel, and then voila, it's fixed. But it doesn't work like that. Vulnerability management nowadays is quite different, and actually I'm gonna show you why. Now, what's the issue actually? The activity usually takes about, let's say you have a team of 13 people, security expertise in your company. It takes about 58 days to actually prioritize, assign, assess, and prepare for remediation the 62,000 vulnerabilities. So what's the problem here? Well, 58 days is about 2 months, and that's official statistics. It only takes about 12 days for a vulnerability to be exploited. Actually, one vulnerability is mostly exploited in the first month of discovery. So if you fix it on the second month, it means that you're probably already compromised. Well, what do we do actually? We pay a lot of money for security experts. That's like 5 or 6 people. We pay them a lot of money to remediate, to assess the findings, to tell us what's the most critical for the company. But guess what? Half of the money we're spending on cybersecurity is pure loss, which means that it's an operational cost, and these security experts which we hired are doing sorting and documentation of the vulnerabilities instead of actual security research. So it means that our resources are completely useless and we're not utilizing them in the best possible way. Right. What do we do to actually know how to remediate the 5% most critical vulnerabilities? Well, first of all, everybody should start with threat modeling, and I'm surprised to see how many organizations are not doing threat modeling. Can you raise hands how many of you actually performed a proper threat modeling for your applications and you actually investigated the boundaries? One hand, thank you. 2, 3. That's great. So you know your threats, I guess. That's a company which knows what is the logical boundaries, what is the front end of the application, who is using it, where is the data going in the backend, how is it sanitized, how is the data input validated. So once you do the threat modeling, you actually understand what your users are doing and what the potential hacker will try to do to compromise your company. Because the interface for the users is the same which the hacker will be using. So that's what we start with. The first model is based on assets. So what are the most important assets in the company? Once I know this, I can actually start creating my threat model. The second one is based on data flow. So you simply start creating beautiful diagrams about what happens with the data, where does the data enter the application, where does it go to the database, what user is having access to the information at this level. So there is a lot of tools, by the way. You can use the OWASP Threat Dragon, for example, which is quite a good tool to help you with the threat modeling. There is a lot of games, by the way, a lot of cybersecurity games. Actually, it's professional tools, but in the form of a game, interactive game, which is helping you to document your threat model. You can rely on models like Stride, which is the Microsoft model, or Pasta. So Stride, for example, is focusing on spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. So these are like the most important things in your threat modeling. The next one is threat model based on network and system connectivity. So when you're making your threat model, you actually need to consider how are the systems interconnected to each other, where are they based, who has access, which system is externally exposed, which one relies in the DMZ, which one is local area network. So you need to consider the data flow, you need to consider backups and cold storage servers, you need to consider all the Git repositories which are sitting out there and waiting to be compromised. You need to think about a lot of things, and this is happening during the threat model. Right, once we have this one, we can actually move to the next phase. We start fixing vulnerabilities, but as I said, you can't fix it all. It's impossible. Now, 3,000 assets is not even a big number. That's like a small to medium-sized company. There is a lot of organizations which are like averaging 10 or 20,000 assets, so you can imagine you can't fix it all. So choose what you're most critical to your business. Choose the 5%. How? Well, first we need to focus on the unknown. What is the unknown? A lot of companies, they don't know their assets. So I'm surprised how many companies are just utilizing the attack surface modules of the vulnerability scanners, and they're like, this is not our asset. Do we have it? Is this ours? Who is managing this one? Who is responsible? So they don't know. You have a bunch of assets which you're unaware of. And guess what? Because you don't know about them, you cannot patch, you cannot update. So these are the first assets that somebody is going to compromise. The second one is actually known and unknown. What is the unknown and unknown? Somebody? I know my assets, but I don't know my vulnerabilities. Why? Because I never started a vulnerability scan, I never initiated security audit, or what I did was I started a network scanner, which gives me like the overview of the system. It rather gives me system information and metadata, but no actual vulnerabilities. It's just the information gathering part. I think all the security officers, they love running vulnerability scans remotely without authentication because everything looks good, the organization is quite safe, everything is green, but in reality you didn't detect anything. You have a lot of vulnerabilities which are unknown for your known assets. And then the third component is maturity, which is I know my assets, I know my vulnerabilities, now let's focus on remediation or mitigation if remediation is not possible at that very moment. A lot of systems actually cannot be patched because they need 27 for uptime. So when you want to patch something or you want to update, you need to raise change requests. They need to be approved by the management, but this is a business critical asset or component for the organization. You cannot do it. So next step is know your assets and blind spots. First of all, identify the most critical assets of the company. So if you have 3,000 systems, roughly about 10, 20 or 50 systems maybe is going to be high priority systems for you or applications. The rest can only lead to further attacks and to further pivoting in the network, but is no critical resources and should not be considered with critical priority. So the thing is, when you know your vulnerabilities, make sure you remediate the vulnerabilities affecting the most critical assets first. I see so many companies nowadays who are trying to fix all the critical vulnerabilities. But guess what? Sometimes a medium vulnerability affecting a KP, key production environment in my company, is so much more critical compared to a critical and exploitable vulnerability affecting my back office printer, right? So focus on the most important assets first. Focus on the owner of the asset. And not only this one, but the asset priority. What's the business function? Is it an ERP system? Is it a CRM system? Is it my critical business application which my users are using and they keep my business running? Or is it just a dev version of my application which is running somewhere on a local server in my office? There is a huge difference. And last but not least, where is the location of the asset? Because very often, especially let's say in interconnected networking systems, one company with many branches across the continent or the world, they forget about their locations. They just run a data center somewhere out there and they forget about their assets. So they're focusing on the important assets, they're protecting the live assets, the key production environment, but the replicated asset, which is called backup standby server, complete replica of the production server, it gets unknown. Nobody takes care of this one. Right, so once we know the assets, now we need to select the proper scanning technique. Another myth is that penetration testing is the ultimate solution. It doesn't work like that. Penetration testing is expensive. A lot of companies cannot afford pen testing. And if you have 3,000 assets, I'm definitely not going to select pen testing for all the assets out there. I would rather run a vulnerability scan, maybe a network-based one. But as I said, there is a common misconception that network-based scanning provides visibility of vulnerabilities. Not really. It gives you the perspective of the most exposed vulnerabilities over on the most exposed assets. Other than that, non-authenticated or non-agent-based vulnerability scan is completely worthless. It doesn't provide any actual vulnerability or weaknesses data. So what I'm suggesting for most critical servers of yours, better have an agent-based scanning, establish an agent-based scanning. It has an administrative access, it pulls all the vulnerabilities out there, and it's so much better compared to the network scanning. Does it mean that we should leave network scanning aside? No, but when I have agent-based scanning, I see all the vulnerabilities. When I run a network remote scanner, I actually see the most critical vulnerabilities first and the most exposed ones. So there is another myth that cloud is secure by design. I'm running my application in the cloud. I don't need pen testing. I don't need security. They're taking care of me. Yeah, but cloud is like a complex thing. You can have SaaS, you can have PaaS, you can have infrastructure as a service. So the cloud is nothing more than a traditional infrastructure in a remote location. So, and they give you some fancy interface where you can toggle the things, where you can toggle network security zones. You can turn on and turn off endpoint protection or EDR. But at the end of the day, if you don't configure the cloud security, it's not secure. It's not secure by design. You're gonna get compromised sooner or later. And then you get on the CEO meeting and you say, well, we're protected, we were on the cloud. Yeah, but you didn't protect the cloud, right? So you're not protected at all. Penetration testing. Now, penetration testing, when you get to the point where you hit pen testing activities, it means that you have no more CVEs to scan to identify. Usually pen testing efforts would not generate CVEs in the majority of the cases. So pen testing is, I'm actually trying to break into something, I'm trying to break the window and get into the house, compared to vulnerability scanning, which is, I observe the house, I see a bunch of open windows and maybe a door which can be easily bypassed, and I create my report based on this one without actually trying to get into the house. Now, when we talk about SCADA, that's a completely different topic. A lot of companies, I see industrial control system companies out there, are afraid to run SCADA security audits, which is a huge mistake because due to the nature of these devices and the specific protocols in use, usually these are not updated, which makes them the most vulnerable. On the other side, they are the most isolated as well. So as long as you keep the bad hackers outside of your SCADA network, you are quite secure. But if you let them, by chance, by some other mistake, into the SCADA network, you better run security audits for the SCADA network, because otherwise it's going to be a huge boom out there. So yeah, that's a very important component. And then another misconception, I see a lot of companies purchasing a vulnerability scanner, and then they say, well, I scanned the domain, there is no vulnerabilities, or the contra, they scan the IP, the server, and they say, well, 5 vulnerabilities, so my application is secure. Application vulnerability scanning is so much different than network vulnerability scanning. One solution, Nessus, another, Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7, I'm not advertising all the solutions out there. They have app scanners and network scanners and Kubernetes scanners. 3 different things, right? So we talked about the SCADA. Also, we need to consider where is the asset based. So if the asset is based in the external infrastructure, well, apparently it's the most vulnerable one, so we need to prioritize. If the asset is based somewhere behind a bunch of firewalls, an intrusion prevention system, Cloudflare, and web application firewall, very hard to get in. I mean, it might be vulnerable, but it might be a critical vulnerability and exploitable one. And the maturity of the exploit code may be pretty high, but nobody can get there, so it cannot be exploited. How about the code? Everybody forgets about the software code. So the software code, there is something which is called SAST, which is static analysis of the code, and DAST, dynamic analysis of the code. People very often confuse the two terms. SAST is when we are actually running a scan of the code itself and not the application. We're not interactively playing with the application. We're not trying to punch the application. We're not trying to inject something which will break the application. We're simply providing a tool with access to the source code, and the tool is actually auditing the source code. One is not excluding the other. I would suggest both, but only for the critical assets. It doesn't make sense if you have, as I said, key production environment, staging, dev, and so on, pre-prod and so on. Doesn't make sense to run 4 different scans for the 4 different instances. Only the prod environment is public facing. That's the one my users have access to. So I would focus my expenses and efforts on the one which is used by the users. On the other side, the dynamic scanner is quite useful because it is playing with the application like a user. So it's trying to inject code, some SQL injections, cross-site scripting. It's trying to play to break the logic of the application to the best extent possible, because the scanners are dummy, you know, they cannot access the application. The pen testing usually is so much more beneficial than the vulnerability scanner because it's examining the business logic. It's trying to think like a human. It's performed by a human, by a living human, not by AI or ML or something out there. It's an actual personnel who is trying to break into the application, considering where does the traffic go? What am I going to do with the data? If this is a banking application, maybe my accountant wants to steal money from me, right? So their low-level user can try to elevate their privileges into a high-privileged user. So this, the dust scanner would not consider, but the pen tester will definitely do. Manual auditing. So that's actually, all these things are manual auditing to a certain extent. Now the dust scanner is an automatic tool, but if you just run the scan and based on these results you don't do any additional actions, yes, it's an automatic process, but it gets you nowhere. So what you need is a manual assessment of the results, and then when you see that there is a potential vulnerability, well, the pen tester will try to break in. He will try to play with the vulnerability to exploit it further, to create an exploit if there is no available, right? They'll try to actually exfiltrate data. They'll try to get to the next mile, to the last mile. Real-time threat intelligence. Can you guess how many of the vulnerabilities are exploited as 0 days? Like percentage, some rough number. 20, okay. 62% of the vulnerabilities are exploited as 0 days. There is something which is called EPSS, and it's not very common nowadays, but it's very, very important so that you can prioritize your vulnerabilities. EPSS is a predictability scoring system. In comparison to the traditional CVSS, which nowadays companies are mostly utilizing, CVSS provides static information about the vulnerability. What's the exploit code maturity? Do I need to be Kevin Mitnick to exploit it? Do I need to have access, administrative access? Do I need to be inside the network? There is also the temporal part, which is how is my infrastructure changing? If somebody gets into the infrastructure by exploiting somewhere, are they going somewhere inside? Are they pivoting and trying to exploit another system, or they will stay where they are? This is what CVSS is doing. However, CVSS doesn't give me information about, is this vulnerability actively exploited as of today? Is it actively exploited if I'm running a hospital application, for example? Is it actively exploited in the hospital environment out there in the world? Is it a 0 day? How many threat actor groups are currently trying to exploit this vulnerability? So that's what EPSS brings me. That's the information. It's beautiful. Versus the static information of CVSS, EPSS brings so much more context to the organization. So it's actually considering the real-time environment, the actual data nowadays, today, not 2 weeks ago or 5 months ago when the vulnerability was observed by some security researchers or hackers. So that's something I would strongly recommend every company to use as part of their vulnerability management program. Just to give you an example, I'm using Mandiant, but it could be any other threat intelligence solution out there. I'm not getting paid by Mandiant to advertise them. Just want to show you the comparison. According to the MVD CVSS rating, the same there is 40% medium vulnerabilities, 46%, 46.8 high vulnerabilities. Now, the same data observed through the threat intelligence solution, you can see how different are the results, because the data on the right picture is static data which was generated over time. The data on the left side is an up-to-date active data which shows if there is malware associated today. Maybe today there is no, but tomorrow there will be, and this information will be updated. So this information you can also extract from the DPSS scoring system and make it work for you. According to my expertise and the one of my colleagues, these are the most important threat intelligence factors to consider during your vulnerability management prioritization. First of all, know what of the CVs are exploited in the wild. You have 62,000 vulnerabilities. How many of them are exploited in the wild? 5, 10, or 20? You have 62,000 vulnerabilities, but only about 100 are weaponized. So if you don't have a weaponized vulnerability, in the most cases, it cannot be exploited. It's like having a rifle, but without ammunition. So if it's not weaponized, it's useless until somebody will create ammunition, a payload for this to be exploited. How many of them are exploited by malware? And this malware can be quite dangerous. It can infect a lot of systems in my network. The malware can spread and infect the whole infrastructure. I would put priority on this, to be honest. And threat actor exploitation. How many of these are actually actively exploited? It could be that I discovered a vulnerability and I reported, somebody created a CVE for this one, the official entity, and it was not exploited for 8 months, not a single try, or maybe 5 or 10 tries by someone out there. Should I be concerned? I would be so much more concerned if the CV was exploited 15,000 times yesterday. Now let's take into consideration a use case which I have created in my practice for an energy company. They discovered a vulnerability which is 6.8 medium. Now the numbers have changed. If you actually observe this CV, this specific CV, the CV now and the CVSS score is different. But this is just an example so that you can see how you can make your calculations to work for you. So if we consider 6.8 a medium vulnerability, but there is no, the CV is not actively trending in the wild, or it is, I'm adding points to the risk score. If the CV is exploited by malware, well, no, it's not so. I'm not adding the score. Is it exploited by 0 day? No, it's not so. I'm not adding to the risk score. What is the exploitation state? Is it confirmed or is it unknown? If it's unknown, I should not be so concerned with this one. But if this is confirmed to exploit, I would put some points on this one. Now let's focus on the asset criticality. Is it affecting a key production environment or a critical application in my organization? Yes, +1 score. That's so much more critical compared to a security compared to an asset which does not require any IT security at all. If I have again a plotter or a printer in my office which is not connected to any other systems, it cannot create any more damage. I will not even consider implementing security measures on this one. If this is a presentation laptop which I'm just using for events and conferences, I have no actual data, no company data on my computer. Should I implement strict security measures? I will not waste time or money with this one. Asset exposure. So again, if the asset is publicly facing, everybody can see the asset. All of you in this room can see the asset and you can try to exploit it tomorrow. I mean, I'm pretty scared already, so I'll increase the risk. But if this is an asset which is very well isolated, a bunch of firewalls, proper network segmentation, the asset doesn't allow for external connections, I will not increase the risk. Why would I do it? And last but not least, a lot of companies actually forget about hardening. Hardening is actually the real deal, and you can eliminate about maybe 70–80% of the vulnerabilities by applying proper hardening to your systems. So if I have, let's say, Microsoft Office macros vulnerability, which allows for remote code execution, so somebody can execute a code and steal my database from my computer. That's pretty dangerous, especially if my database is not encrypted, it's it contains sensitive information. Well, yeah, but if I disabled Microsoft macros by design in my GPO, for example, and I would not allow for a code to be executed on my system, again, doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, let them try to exploit it. I mean, they're getting nowhere because Microsoft is not exploitable at this point because I hardened my asset. Or if the vulnerability requires connection to the command and control server. Yeah, but I disabled external connections from my system. So what? I'm gonna get infected, but I cannot, my system cannot communicate with the control server of the hackers. So it makes it useless. I would suggest adopting the strategy to your specific organization, but basically that's the triage. That's the components you are considering in the context of your specific organization to protect it. CV critical doesn't mean anything nowadays. You have hundreds of thousands of these. But when you consider these criteria, then you narrow down to 50 or 100 vulnerabilities which are important to your specific organization. Now, a few basic measures. What can you do to help yourself? We talked about it. You can have multiple security audits. You can implement some strong defenses. But at the end of the day, not everybody can afford it. I work with a lot of startup companies, fintech companies, medtech companies. They don't have the money. They need budget to expand, to evolve. They need budget to make their brand awareness, to develop their sales and marketing. Nobody wants to invest in cybersecurity at this basic level of development. What can you do about it? These are the 3 basic steps which you can implement at no money. Network security. Protect your assets. It eliminates about 60-70% of the vulnerabilities. If you have a proper network segmentation, I cannot stress enough how many issues this one is resolving by itself. The second one, application whitelisting. How many of you have application whitelisting on their systems? Okay, now I see more hands, but again, it's like 10 people. So application whitelisting is already available in your Windows infrastructure, and you can have identical means of securing applications, which is in general harder to run on Linux systems, but there is ways to protect it. And it's just a matter of configuration. You don't need to purchase expensive solutions out there and spend huge amount of money, thousands of euros on this one. You just need to have someone to configure this for you based on your specific needs. And by this one, you're eliminating about half of the vulnerabilities out there. And last but not least, system hardening. That's the ultimate goal. If you have a golden image, if you have one image which you're distributing across the company, and this one has some predefined security measures in place, well, you're eliminating so many of these vulnerabilities. If you only consider the Center for Internet and Security benchmarks, usually you have, for the Windows systems, you have about 400 available security controls to implement. Start with this. You can have 100 or 50. You can have 200 security controls. It's some start. You're already ahead of the hackers. You can have it completely tailored to your needs. I see a lot of companies selling complex MDM solutions for huge amount of money. But guess what? You have security hardening for your mobile devices as well, for Android and iOS. So you can simply go and configure these devices with certain benchmark which is suitable to the organization needs, to the specific department, to the specific group of people. Maybe the accountant needs one set of rules, but the IT guys in the company, they need a bit more, right? We have different needs, everybody has different needs. And this is something quite easy to implement. Now, for example, you can use Ansible to implement hardening across all the systems in your organization. You select the policy, the controls which you want to apply, you distribute across the systems, and on the next day everything stops working. So, yeah, but the reality is on the next day everything is protected. And you should always consider what will stop working indeed. Now, you can reach the CIS benchmarks, but you can also create your custom list. Pretty much all the application vulnerability scanners support CIS benchmarks, and you can create them tailored based on your needs. thank you very much for your attention. I hope that with this information, now you can fortify your defenses and you can make use of what you just learned. Cybersecurity triage and vulnerability intelligence nowadays is based on threat intelligence data, live data, hardening of the asset, how protected is my asset, exposure of my asset, and how important is this asset for me and for my organization. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few questions for you. People were actually very active during this one, so
Pretty nice.
what do you think about the upcoming Cyber Resilience Act? Will that change the game of vulnerability management?
It's already there. You have ISO 27001, you have PCI DSS, you have NIS2. They overlap about 80%. But did you read it? Did you actually prepare for this one? I think the same will be with Cyber Resilience Act. Some rules are written, and it's a matter of interpretation and understanding. Nobody is saying specifically what you need to have in place. Can you still hear me?
Yes,
yeah?
I think so.
So I think it's a great thing to happen, but it brings maturity in the organizations. It's not about the specific security controls which are outlined in the Cyber Resilience Act. It's a great thing, don't get me wrong. I think it must be there, and more companies must be conscious about the personal data, about the sensitive information, trade secrets. You should protect them, yes. And the Cyber Resilience Act gives you a framework how to do it and where you should be looking for to fortify your infrastructure. I think it's changing the way of thinking, it's changing the mentality. It's like GDPR. Before GDPR, we knew that we have to protect our personal data, but how many were actually protecting it, right? So now this one is establishing rules to follow, which companies, they usually know that they have to follow these rules anyway, but they don't because there is no a regulation to enforce it. So I think more companies will be forced to protect the data nowadays because of the Resilience Act.
Okay, the next question we have is, do you think the idea of priority leads towards perimeter security instead of a defense in-depth model?
Both, you should have layered defense. If you only have perimeter defense, you're getting nowhere. You're receiving a phishing email, you open the attachment or the file, they are inside, so your perimeter security is already busted. So
balance that with the idea of prioritizing.
Yeah, so I again put my focus on prioritizing my assets and where are my assets based. I need to have perimeter defense, that's for sure. And that's not a complex thing to establish actually. It's a pretty easy configuration change. However, if I don't have a proper segmentation between my different networks, if I don't have proper segmentation between my departments, between my locations across Europe, for example, well, perimeter security would not help you. It's a complex approach. You need to have multi-layer defense. Otherwise, you're getting nowhere.
Okay, then we have a question about how can vulnerabilities be communicated to developers in a way that prevents them from feeling overwhelmed, considering that fixing the issue halts new development?
By using Kikimora.io. So that's what we've been working on for the last 3 years, because we started as security consultants, specialized in vulnerability assessment and pen testing, but we were asked to actually identify vulnerabilities, scan, assess, prioritize, assign, and have them remediated, because we're not remediating, but we're asking people to remediate, and we're pushing. We're like the guy with the stick who is, did you remediate? Did you fix this one? So we got tired of doing this, and that's why we created Kikimora.io, which is a vulnerability management solution, and it allows you to orchestrate all the scans and tests and audits and cloud security audits. Then you can, inside our solution, you can assess, you can prioritize based on the importance of the asset. You can see the evidence for each vulnerability, the remediation steps. There is an AI assistant which is helping you with steps how to reproduce the vulnerability, how to remediate, how critical it is, how many affected assets you have, how many of them are gonna get compromised tomorrow. So yeah, by creating your own solution. I mean, it's a matter of process. We automated the process by creating a software application, but you can achieve it without a software application as well. You can actually create like a dashboard or interactive reporting with tools freely on the market with Power BI, for example, or similar. So you have your ways. If you don't have budget for cybersecurity tools, you can make it by yourself. But as I said, storing the data in an Excel sheet is not the best approach, and it doesn't work.
Okay, and then I think we should go with one more question. There are several others, but we won't have time for them all, and you will be at the Ask Me Anything stand afterwards, presumably, so you can ask them directly. But why is Kikimura's risk use case matrix better than the matrices of other companies?
All right, so we tailored Kikimura to the specific needs of small organizations right now. There is a lot of vulnerability scanners out there, a lot of great enterprise solutions, and we have a lot of great competitors. Mostly in the US, by the way, not so much in Europe, though. However, what we did, we saw that a lot of companies, they don't have the internal expertise to fix it. So they cannot afford to hire a pen tester, security auditor, vulnerability analyst, system administrator, and so on. They don't have the need for this. They only need like 10 or 20 hours of consulting per month. So that's why we connected our service and consulting knowledge with the solution. So with the Kikimura subscription, every user gets X amount of hours of security consulting per month. So we can spend 3 hours on pen testing, 2 hours on secure code auditing, 5 hours on vulnerability assessment, and whatever suits your needs. That's one thing. Then the other one is nowadays data needs to be manageable in a much more easier and understandable way. So that's why we created an AI assistant which is helping you by digesting your current vulnerability database, reaching out to MVD for the threat for the weaknesses information, what is this one, how to remediate, how to reproduce, and so on. And now we are releasing also the threat intel feed so that you can know how critical and how actively exploited the vulnerability is today, not 2 weeks ago.
Perfect, thank you.
And last thing, do you know how many vulnerabilities has an average Windows system? All of them. That's a very good answer. 1,000, actually. 1,000 security misconfigurations, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. I'm gonna be here myself, and you can find us in the corridor. Me and my team are having a booth stand, and thank you for the opportunity to be gold partner of the event, so you can meet us and talk more about security.